His brothers were stunned. The Egyptians, who just left the gathering, were in shock, hearing the wailing of Joseph. This was a cry that reverberated all the way to the house of Pharaoh. The topic of gossip across the land of Egypt was how their governor had been reunited with his long-lost brothers. If anyone had a right to hate, it was Joseph. But he shows no sign of hate, no sign of revenge. Joseph demonstrates incredible forgiveness. Joseph shows us how we should respond to tough moments in life. God prepared Joseph during those 13 dark years for his greater plan of salvation. God was willing to send a famine, causing multi-continent-wide devastation, in order to draw Israel into Egypt, to ensure a prophecy given in Genesis 15 is fulfilled. Genesis 45 verse 1. Then Joseph could not restrain himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, "Make everyone go out from me," so that no one stood with him, while Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud, and the Egyptians and the house of Pharaoh heard it. Joseph's psyop is now completed. He has his brothers' confession of their guilt in their treatment of him. He's confirmed his brothers are no longer driven by petty jealousy and envy. His brothers have just demonstrated a willingness to be enslaved in order to spare Benjamin, in a vain attempt to atone for their earlier wrong committed against Joseph. Joseph can see they love their father. They're willing to risk their own life in order to spare their father further sadness. His mission complete. Joseph could no longer restrain himself from revealing who he was. In fact, at this point, there was no further reason to continue the performance. He ordered in Egyptian a loud crying proclamation. Everyone understood the immediacy of the command. The servants and officials, who were forever snivelling at hand to do the governor's bidding, scurried from the room. They heard the tone of Joseph's command. Never had they heard such emotion and feeling, such urgency spoken by their master. With the servants barely out of the room, Joseph took off the mask of Governor Zaphnath-Paneah, revealing himself to his brothers. And 22 years of emotion burst from deep within Joseph. He wept aloud. He completely broke down. His brothers were stunned. The Egyptians, who just left the gathering, were in shock, hearing the wailing of Joseph in the adjacent room. This was a cry that reverberated all the way to the house of Pharaoh. Something incredible has occurred in Egypt. Something wonderful. Something of epic emotional impact. The topic of gossip across the land of Egypt was how their governor had been reunited with his long-lost brothers. Verse 3, Then Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Does my father still live?" We have a quaint old saying in Australia, "You look like a stunned mullet." If you want to know what this Aussie slang means, just imagine the faces of Joseph's brothers at this point. Upon hearing the words, "I am Joseph. Does my father still live?" You may as well explain trigonometry to a turtle. The brothers' brains could not compute the words coming from the Egyptian governor's mouth. But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed in his presence. Total stunned mullets. Dismayed, disbelieving. Are we dreaming? Can this be true? Verse 4, And Joseph said to his brothers, "Please come near to me." So they came near. Then he said, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt." Comprehension slowly dawning upon them. Joseph? Sold into Egypt? Our brother? Who we so wronged? No doubt Joseph, being a blubbering mess, only added to the confusion. So Joseph beckons them to come close to him. It may have been, in all their previous encounters, he kept a cool and commanding distance between him and his brothers. Verse 5, but now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither ploughing nor harvesting. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. What a beautiful heart Joseph had. What a godly example to all people of all ages. Joseph was betrayed, sold into slavery by his brothers, then falsely accused of attempted rape, and imprisoned for years. If anyone had a right to be bitter, vindictive, carry a grudge, desire revenge, if anyone had a right to hate, it was Joseph. But he shows no sign of hate, no sign of bitterness, no sign of revenge. Joseph demonstrates incredible forgiveness, Christ-like forgiveness. This was far from weakness in Joseph. The ability to forgive shows incredible strength of character. Chuck Swindoll said Joseph was great because of his great faith in God, which manifested itself in a magnanimous attitude towards others and his magnificent attitude toward difficulties. A strong faith leads to a good attitude. Joseph shows us how we should respond to tough moments in life. He understood the bigger plans of God. God used his brother's envy for a greater good. God prepared Joseph during those 13 dark years for his greater plan of salvation. When evil things happen to you, turn to God for strength. Trust in God's greater plans. Joseph doesn't blame his brothers or God. Rather, he sees God's good purpose in the terrible things that happen to him. 4 times in this chapter, Joseph articulates God was behind what happened to him. Verse 8, so now it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. It's interesting to hear Joseph declare God has made Joseph a father to Pharaoh. Joseph is now 39 years of age, and he's become a father-like figure to Pharaoh, strongly hinting to us that Pharaoh was a young man whose biological father had died. Additional evidence to support this is seen in the text of Scripture. 11 years earlier, as recorded in Genesis 40, Joseph the prisoner was directed to look after 2 of Pharaoh's officials recently imprisoned. There's an implied youthful impulsiveness in a king who throws 2 of his high-ranking officials into jail. And soon after, on his birthday, he brought those 2 officials from the dungeon, restoring one and killing the other. Then 2 years later, as recorded in Genesis 41, when Joseph was only 30, Joseph was summoned from prison to appear before Pharaoh, and later that same day made vice-regent of all Egypt, simply because Joseph offered a viable interpretation to the king's dream. These actions reveal to me this Pharaoh was a young man, likely in his teens, when he came to power. Verse 9, hurry and go up to my father and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not tarry. You shall dwell in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near to me, you and your children, your children's children, your flocks and your herds, and all that you have. There I will provide for you, lest you and your household and all that you have come to poverty, for there are still 5 years of famine. At this point, Joseph's brothers are no doubt still in a state of dazed disbelief. And Joseph starts commanding them, hurry, go back to father, bring him to me. They hadn't even turned their attention to admitting their grave deception before their father. What's Dad going to say to us about our evil actions? Joseph's only focus is reunion, whereas they have to confront revelation, a total unveiling of their sins. It's also interesting to speculate Joseph's been planning a place of habitation for his family since his brothers first coming to Egypt. Remembering at Jesus' first coming, he declared, "And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there you may be also." Goshen, meaning to draw near, was the place Joseph had prepared for his family, good, fertile land of the Nile Delta. Joseph advised his brothers 5 more years of famine remained, and he would provide for his brethren during these difficult years. Perhaps this 5 was linked to the 5-fold supply of food supplied to Benjamin, and the 5 changes of clothes to be given in verse 22. Verse 12. "And behold your eyes, and the eyes of my brother Benjamin. See that it is my mouth that speaks to you. So you shall tell my father of all my glory in Egypt, and of all that you have seen, and you shall hurry and bring my father down here." Then he fell on his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept on his neck. Moreover, he kissed all his brothers and wept over them, and after that his brothers talked with him. Joseph, understandably, did a lot of weeping. Now take a guess at how many times Genesis records Joseph as having cried. If you guess 7 times, you're completely correct. He wept in verses 2, 14 and 15 of this chapter alone. He also wept once each in chapters 42 and 43. He'll weep in chapter 46 upon reuniting with his father, and he'll weep a 7th and final time upon the passing of his father, as recorded in chapter 50. Joseph also in these verses extinguishes any thoughts the 10 older brothers might have had about keeping this news from Jacob. Firstly, the famine is going to last another 5 years, meaning you'll have to return to Egypt for more grain. Also, now Benjamin, my full-blood brother, knows what you did, so you have to come clean to Dad. It's only once Joseph hugs and weeps over his 10 older brothers, they finally untied their tongues and were able to speak with Joseph. Verse 16, "Now the report of it was heard in Pharaoh's house, saying, Joseph's brothers have come, so it pleased Pharaoh and his servants well." Even though the Egyptians were somewhat repulsed by these Semite sheep herders, this story was better than a Hollywood blockbuster. Pharaoh and the elites of Egypt were overjoyed to hear of this wonderful reunion. Verse 17, "And Pharaoh said to Joseph, Say to your brothers, do this, load your animals and depart. Go to the land of Canaan. Bring your father and your households and come to me. I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you will eat the fat of the land." Now even Pharaoh was excited to meet the ancient father of his most trusted advisor, the father of his father figure. Verse 19, "Now you are commanded, do this, take carts out of the land of Egypt for your little ones and your wives, bring your father and come. Also, do not be concerned about your goods, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours." Not only did Israel have the blessing and provisioning of the governor of Egypt, now mighty Pharaoh promised blessing, protection, and provisioning. The very best of Egypt would be set aside for this Hebrew family. Don't worry if you have to leave some things behind. Come to Egypt quickly. Everything you ever dreamed of will be yours as guests of Pharaoh in the kingdom of Egypt. Verse 21, "Then the sons of Israel did so, and Joseph gave them carts according to the command of Pharaoh, and he gave them provisions for the journey. He gave to all of them, to each man, changes of garments. But to Benjamin he gave 300 pieces of silver and 5 changes of garments. And he sent to his father these things, 10 donkeys loaded with the good things of Egypt, and 10 female donkeys loaded with grain, bread, and food for his father for the journey. So he sent his brothers away, and they departed. And he said to them, See that you do not become troubled along the way. And so Joseph blessed his long-lost family with the riches of Egypt. New garments for his brothers, no doubt the latest Egyptian fashion to help them not so obviously stand out in Egypt. He knew Pharaoh would want to meet his family, Perhaps he's trying to help make them more presentable. Benjamin receives a great bounty, 300 pieces of silver, 15 times the price Joseph was sold for, and 5 lots of new Egyptian clothing. Joseph had lost the last 22 years seeing his baby brother grow up. These gifts would never make up for that lost time, but he wanted to show Benjamin how much he was loved. And finally, Joseph supplies 20 donkeys loaded with food and good things from Egypt to prove to his father his brother's account of Joseph's miraculous return from the dead was true. Jacob had good reason to doubt the veracity of his son's witness. But these 20 overladen donkeys was objective proof of Joseph's survival and rise to power. Verse 25. Then they went up out of Egypt and came to the land of Canaan, to Jacob their father. And they told him, saying, Joseph is still alive, and he is governor over all the land of Egypt. And Jacob's heart stood still, because he did not believe them. But when they told him all the words which Joseph had said to them, and when he saw the carts which Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of Jacob, their father, revived. Then Israel said, It is enough. Joseph, my son, is still alive. I will go and see him before I die. It is simply amazing and demonstrates the common failing of men. Israel was quick to believe the lie about Joseph, the bad news told to him 22 years earlier that Joseph was dead. But Israel struggled to believe the good news, the truth, that Joseph was alive, back from the dead and ruling in Egypt. It was the Egyptian carts full of luxury goods that finally convinced Israel to believe. I love the wording of verse 27. The spirit of Jacob, their father, revived. This broken old man is injected with a dose of new life. My precious son lives? The colour returned to his face. 17 more years of life pulsed through Jacob's weary legs. Joseph, my son, who I thought was dead, is alive? Israel now has something to live for. The power of hope practically demonstrated. Looking at the bigger picture, God was willing to send a famine, causing multi-continent-wide devastation, in order to draw Israel into Egypt, to ensure a prophecy given in Genesis 15 is fulfilled. Israel had to leave the land of promise and go to Egypt, where they will be afflicted for 400 years, serving as slaves. Until our next study, may God richly bless you all.